The night Cora Wynne saved a little boy's life, she didn't think about consequences. She didn't think about anything at all. She just moved. That's the kind of girl she was. But we'll get to that in a moment. First, you need to understand what kind of man Nico Draven was, because without that, none of what happened next makes any sense. In the city of Harlow Bay, there were two kinds of power: the kind that got photographed at ribbon-cutting ceremonies and quoted in morning newspapers. And then there was the kind that made those same men go pale when a certain name was mentioned over the phone. Nico Draven was the second kind. He didn't attend galas. He didn't give interviews. He didn't need to. The Draven name had been woven into the bones of Harlow Bay for 3 generations. In the ports, in the construction contracts, in the quiet phone calls that made inconvenient problems disappear before sunrise. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone understood. You didn't cross the Dravens. You didn't even look at them wrong. Nico himself was 41 years old, with dark eyes that never seemed to blink at the wrong moment, and hands that were always too still for someone with his reputation. He wore gray, always gray. He sat at the corner table of Marcello's every Thursday evening, same chair, same angle, back to the wall, facing the door, and he ate alone, because the only company he kept voluntarily was his own. The staff at Marcello's had learned not to stare. The maitre d', a nervous man named Henri, had specifically instructed every server on the floor. You take Mr. Draven's order, you bring Mr. Draven's food, you do not linger, you do not make conversation, and above all, you do not spill anything. Cora Wynne had worked at Marcello's for 11 days. She was 22, barely 5'4", with the kind of face that made people think she was younger than she was, which she hated because she'd been fighting to be taken seriously her entire life. She'd taken the waitressing job to cover tuition for her second year of nursing school, after her financial aid got tangled in a bureaucratic nightmare that she'd been trying to unknot for 6 weeks. She was exhausted most of the time. She was behind on rent. She smiled anyway, because tips were the difference between eating and not eating. And Cora Wynne had decided a long time ago that she wasn't going to let circumstances turn her into someone she didn't like. She hadn't been assigned to Mr. Draven's section. That was important to understand later. She was never supposed to be near him at all. Her section was the middle of the floor, the round tables near the window, where the Thursday dinner crowd came in around 7:30. Couples celebrating, business dinners, a few regulars who liked the osso buco. She'd learned the rhythms of it. She was good at her job in the way that people who need to survive at something tend to get good quickly. The problem started with a child. The Kessler party had reserved the large table by the east wall. A corporate group, 8 adults and, apparently, a last-minute addition, one 7-year-old boy named Theo, who belonged to one of the executives and had nowhere else to be that evening. He'd been given a tablet and told to stay quiet. He did, mostly, until he didn't. Cora was carrying a tray of water glasses past the Kessler table when she noticed it. The boy had stopped looking at his tablet. He was sitting very still in a way that children almost never sat still. Not calm, but frozen. His face had gone a strange color. His hands were at his throat. The adults around him were mid-conversation, mid-laughter, mid-everything. Nobody was looking at him. Cora set the tray down on the nearest surface, which happened to be an empty chair, and crossed to him in 4 steps. "Hey," she said, dropping to his level. "Theo, are you okay?" He wasn't okay. He couldn't speak, couldn't draw air. His lips were starting to change color. Cora didn't scream for help first. She didn't freeze. She got behind him, positioned her hands the way she'd practiced in her first-year clinical module 14 months ago, and she performed the Heimlich maneuver twice, clean and firm, the way the mannequin in the simulation room had taught her. A piece of bread roll hit the tablecloth. Theo gasped, a ragged, desperate, beautiful sound, and then he started crying, which meant his airway was open, which meant he was going to be fine. The table around them erupted. Cora was still crouched behind the boy, one hand on his back, saying, "Breathe slow, you're okay, I've got you," when she became aware that the entire restaurant had gone silent. Not the polite quiet of a room trying not to eavesdrop, the absolute silence of a space where something has shifted. She looked up. Nico Draven was standing 6 feet away. She hadn't seen him move. She didn't know when he'd crossed from his corner table. He was just there, very still, in his gray suit, looking at the boy. His face was unreadable. That was the first thing she noticed. Not cold. She'd expected cold, from everything she'd absorbed in 11 days of working at Marcello's. But unreadable was different from cold. It was like watching a lake with nothing moving on the surface and not knowing how deep it went. "Is he all right?" Nico Draven said. It wasn't a question, exactly. It was the kind of statement that expected a truthful answer immediately. "He will be," Cora said. "He needs water, small sips. He should see a doctor tonight, but he's breathing." Nico looked at her then, really looked at her, in a way that felt like being measured for something she hadn't agreed to be measured for. "You're a doctor?" he said. "Nursing student." She stood up because crouching felt wrong for this conversation, though she was still considerably shorter than him. "Second year. I've practiced this. He's okay." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he nodded once, turned, and walked back to his corner table. The restaurant slowly, carefully exhaled. Henri appeared at Cora's elbow approximately 4 seconds later, looking like a man who'd briefly considered fainting and decided against it. "Are you all right, Miss Wynne? I'll take it from here. Please, go back to your section. Everything is fine. I need someone to bring that child water," Cora said. "And call his parents. The man at the table, his father, I think, needs to know that Theo should be seen tonight." Of course, of course." Henri was already waving at another server. "Please, your section." She went back to her section. Her hands were steady. She was a little proud of that. She didn't look at Nico Draven's table again for the rest of the evening, which meant she didn't see him watching her, which was probably for the best. What she also didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that the child she'd just saved was Theodore Kessler Jr., and that Theodore Kessler Sr. was one of 3 men who handled Nico Draven's legitimate business holdings in the Northeastern Corridor. And she didn't know that Nico Draven had noticed her the moment she walked into Marcello's 11 days ago, not because of anything she'd done, but because Nico Draven noticed everything. It was how he'd survived this long. But she'd registered as unremarkable then. A new server, young, quick on her feet. He'd filed her away the same way he filed away the exits and the positions of every other person in the room. Useful information, low priority. That filing had been revised. She didn't think about Nico Draven in the days that followed. She thought about her tuition problem, about her roommate's broken radiator, about the 12-hour clinical rotation she had on Saturday that required her to be functional on 4 hours of sleep. She worked her Thursday shift at Marcello's and didn't see him. Henri told her he hadn't come in that week, though Henri delivered this information in a tone that suggested he was bracing for something, and she worked Friday and Saturday and didn't think about gray suits or unblinking dark eyes. She thought about them a little on Sunday. She told herself it was nothing. It wasn't nothing, but she was very good at telling herself things and moving on. The following Thursday, she was assigned to a different section. This was not an accident, she realized immediately. Henri had put her on the corner section, Nico Draven's section. She found Henri in the back hallway before the dinner rush and said, "I think there's been a mistake with the floor plan." Henri smiled at her with the expression of a man who was absolutely not going to tell her what was happening. "No mistake, Miss Wynne. Have a good service." She stood in the hallway for 3 seconds, then went back to work. He arrived at 7:15. Same chair, same gray. He sat. He opened the menu that he certainly didn't need, and he waited. Cora walked over with the water and the bread basket and said, "Good evening, Mr. Draven. Can I start you with anything?" In the same voice she used for every other table, because she had decided on the walkover that she was going to be completely, professionally normal about this. He looked up from the menu. "You remembered the name. Everyone here knows your name, Mr. Draven." A pause. Something moved across his face, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "The Barolo," he said. 2018, if they have it, I'll check." They did have it. She brought it. She poured without spilling, which she was privately pleased about. He ordered the Bronzino. She brought the Bronzino. The dinner progressed with the efficient quiet of 2 people who were both, in their own way, professionals. He was finishing the fish when he spoke again. "How long have you been in nursing school?" She'd been expecting something. She hadn't expected that. 14 months, she said. 1 year left. If I can sort out a financial aid issue. What kind of issue? The question was direct, not casual, direct. The way a person asks something when they actually wanted the answer, not just the shape of a conversation. She told him. She wasn't sure why. The whole tangle of it. The scholarship she'd qualified for, that was stuck in processing because of an administrative error in her undergraduate record, the appeals she'd filed, the office that kept transferring her to a different extension every time she called. She said it quickly, the way she'd gotten used to explaining it. Not asking for sympathy, just laying out the facts. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "The name of the financial aid director." "Excuse me? At the school. What's the director's name?" Mr. Patterson. Gerald Patterson. "But thank you," Nico Draven said, and returned to his wine. She opened her mouth, she closed it. She went to check on her other table. 3 days later, the school called. Her financial aid had been fully processed, all outstanding issues resolved. Gerald Patterson himself left a voicemail that was almost peculiarly apologetic. Cora stood in her kitchen holding the phone for a long time. Then she went to her next shift at Marcello's and didn't say a word about it because she didn't know what words to use. But someone else had something to say. His name was Garrett Lowe, and he'd been Cora's ex-boyfriend for 4 months. Ex meaning she'd ended things in February, after realizing that his consistent low-grade contempt for her life choices had become something she could no longer absorb and still function. He was an associate at a downtown law firm, 31 years old, with the specific confidence of someone who'd always been told he was impressive, without being given much evidence to test that impression against. She hadn't thought about Garrett Lowe since March. Garrett Lowe apparently had been thinking about Cora Wynn. She was covering a Tuesday lunch shift when he walked into Marcello's with 2 other suits and got seated in her section by a host who didn't know the history and wouldn't have cared if she did. Cora saw him and felt nothing except a faint tiredness, the way you feel about an old argument you already won. She composed her face and went to take the table. Garrett saw her when she was 3 steps away. The calculation happened visibly on his face. Surprise, then something else, something that had always been there, and that she'd spent 8 months convincing herself wasn't. "Well," he said, "still here. Good afternoon. Can I start you with water? I heard you gave up on the nursing thing." He said it to his colleagues as much as to her, a performance for an audience, which was his preferred format. "Water, or something else," Cora said. "I always told her she was wasting her time," Garrett continued, turning slightly to the man on his left. "The grades weren't really there. No offense," he added to Cora in the tone of someone offering maximum offense while maintaining deniability. The man on his left smiled uncomfortably. The man on his right was looking at his phone. Cora wrote water on her pad. "I'll give you a few minutes with the menu." She used to want to be a doctor, Garrett told his colleagues, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of a man who has never once questioned his right to take up space. "I had to explain the MCAT situation to her. Gently." He paused. "She didn't take it well. The Branzino is very good today," Cora said pleasantly. "I'll be back in a few minutes." She turned to go. "You forgot my drink order." She stopped, turned back. "You didn't give me one. I was getting there." He tilted his head, and there was something in it, the particular angle of someone testing a boundary and expecting it to hold. Sparkling water. And honestly, you could smile more. It's a customer service job. The table next to them had gone quiet. Cora wrote sparkling on her pad. "And," Garrett said with the leisurely timing of someone who's been saving the best for last, "Huh? You've got something on your uniform. Right there." He gestured vaguely. "You might want to fix that before your manager sees." There was nothing on her uniform. She knew there was nothing on her uniform. He knew she knew. That wasn't the point. The point was the power of making her look down, of making her check, of the half-second where she had to decide whether to believe him or trust herself, in front of his audience, in her own workplace. She didn't look down. "I'll get your water," she said, and walked to the service station with her back straight and her hands loose at her sides, and she stood there for exactly 10 seconds reminding herself that she had 6 hours left in her shift, that she needed this job, that Garrett Lowe was a Tuesday afternoon, and she was a whole rest of her life. She didn't notice the corner table. She'd forgotten, in the anxiety of managing the situation, that the corner table was sometimes occupied at Tuesday lunch by a man who conducted certain quiet meetings in the back dining room and occasionally took his midday meal in the main room afterward. Nico Draven had been there for 40 minutes. He had watched the entire thing. She brought the sparkling water. She took the food orders. She moved through the rest of the table's lunch with the practiced efficiency of someone who has learned to exist in a space without letting it see them flinch. Garrett tipped 11%. She'd expected worse. She was bussing a table near the window when Henri appeared beside her, and his expression was the one she'd started to recognize. The one that meant something was happening that Henri couldn't explain and wasn't going to try to. Mr. Draven would like a word, Miss Wynne. She set down the stack of plates very carefully. About, he didn't say. She crossed to the corner table. Nico Draven was finishing a coffee, and he did not look up immediately when she arrived, which she'd started to understand was not rudeness. It was simply that he finished things before beginning other things. He looked up. "Sit down," he said. "I'm on shift. I've spoken to Henri." He gestured at the chair across from him with 2 fingers. "Please." She sat. It was the please that did it, not because it made her feel obligated, but because from him it sounded like it cost something. "The man at table 7, Nico said. "He's a former acquaintance. It's fine. It didn't look fine. I handled it." "You did," he said, and the simplicity of it caught her off guard. No qualifier, no but. Just acknowledgement. "I know who he is, Garrett Lowe." "Halpern and Lowe Associates." She blinked. "How? I pay attention." He turned his coffee cup a 1/4 inch on its saucer, the small, precise gesture she'd noticed before. "He's been passed over for partner twice. There was a complaint filed against him by a paralegal in 2023 that didn't go anywhere. He drives a car he can't afford and tells people he's 30. Cora stared at him. "He's 31, Nico Draven said. "I mention this only because people who perform superiority publicly are usually protecting something they know is inadequate. You likely already knew this." She had. She just needed someone else to say it out loud. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. The restaurant moved around them. Dishes, soft conversation, Henri hovering at a distance with the expression of a man pretending he wasn't hovering. "You saved a child's life in this room," Nico Draven said, without hesitating. "You didn't look for permission or applause. You just moved." He paused. "And then this afternoon, a man who is significantly less than you performed his insignificance in your direction, and you held your composure when most people wouldn't have." Cora didn't say anything. "I'm telling you," he said, "because you should hear it from someone who has no reason to flatter you." The thing was, she believed him. Not because she was naive, but because she'd become fairly good at reading people, and nothing in Nico Draven's face suggested he'd ever bothered with flattery in his life. Flattery required wanting something from the other person. He looked like someone who simply took what he wanted or didn't, and the distinction was entirely on his terms. "Thank you," she said, "for the financial aid situation." He didn't confirm or deny. "How much longer do you plan to work here?" "Until I graduate. About a year. And after? Hospital work. Trauma if I can get placed, that's what I want." He studied her for a moment. "That's a hard field." "I know." She met his gaze. "I'm good under pressure. I proved that, I think." Something shifted in his expression, not the almost amusement from before, something quieter and more serious. "You did," he said. She stood up. "I should get back to my tables." He nodded. But as she turned to go, he said, "Miss Wynne." She looked back. "Garrett Lowe will not be returning to Marcello's." She opened her mouth to say something about that. About whether he had the right, about whether she needed it, about several things, and then she looked at him and understood that it was already decided, the way everything with Nico Draven was already decided, and that arguing would be mistaking the nature of what she was dealing with. "Okay," she said. He nodded once, and she went back to work. She thought about it for the next 4 days more than she'd planned to. Not about Garrett, whose absence from her mental landscape had become so complete, she couldn't locate why she'd spent 8 months with him in the first place. She thought about the corner table, about a man who had fixed her financial aid problem, without being asked and without mentioning it, who had delivered a precise and accurate psychological profile of her ex-boyfriend as casually as a weather report, and who had actually looked at her, with the full attention of someone who was almost never surprised, and said, "You're good under pressure," like he was confirming a measurement. She thought about what it meant that she didn't find it frightening. She probably should have found it frightening. She was a 22-year-old nursing student from a two-bedroom apartment in the East End of Harlow Bay. She'd done minimal research, just enough to confirm what she'd absorbed. A man whose name showed up in court documents that never resulted in charges, in business filings that connected to other business filings, that connected to things she didn't want to look at directly. He was someone people got out of the way of on the street without knowing why. She should have filed him away. Interesting, untouchable, not her world. But he'd looked at her. Not like she was interesting. Like she was real, in some way that the rest of the room wasn't quite real. She was in the middle of a study block on Thursday afternoon, 3 hours before her shift, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. Miss Wynne. His voice on the phone was the same as in person, measured, without wasted space. "I have a situation. I need someone with medical competence and the ability to remain calm. I realize this is an unusual request." Cora put down her textbook. "What kind of situation?" "My nephew. He's 8. He had a reaction to something at school. They gave him the wrong medication during a routine check. He's been assessed at urgent care and they say he's stable, but he's frightened, and the woman I normally have available for these situations is out of the city." She heard, underneath the precision of the delivery, something and controlled that was covering something else. "Where is he?" He gave her an address. The good part of the city, the part where the buildings had names instead of numbers. She calculated shift, travel, and the specific expression she'd heard in his voice. "I'll be there in 40 minutes. I'll send a car. I have a car." A pause. "Of course." Then, "Thank you, Miss Wynne." She was already looking for her nursing bag. The apartment building was the kind that had a person standing at the door whose entire job was to decide who deserved entry. He took one look at Cora's face, asked her name, and said, 32nd floor, Mr. Draven is expecting you," without any of the usual theater. Nico Draven met her in the hallway outside the apartment, still in the gray suit, though he'd taken the jacket off. It was the most undone she'd seen him. He walked her through without preamble. The boy's name was Felix, 8 years old, had been given an antihistamine at school that interacted badly with a beta blocker he took for a mild cardiac arrhythmia. The urgent care had confirmed no lasting damage, but Felix had been frightened and confused for 2 hours and was now quiet in a way that Nico described, very briefly, as wrong for him. "What's he normally like?" Cora asked. Something moved across Nico's face. "Loud," he said. "He argues about everything. He has opinions about the quality of every meal I make for him. He's not quiet." They went in. Felix was sitting on a large couch in a room full of books, wrapped in a blanket with a glass of juice on the table in front of him that he hadn't touched. He was dark-haired, pale from the day's events, and he looked at Cora with the careful assessment of a child who'd inherited someone's habit of watching. "Hi," Cora said, sitting on the coffee table across from him, because she'd learned that being at eye level mattered. "I'm Cora. I'm a nursing student. Your uncle asked me to come check on you. Is that okay?" Felix studied her. "Are you going to give me something?" "Nope. Just talk. Maybe take your pulse. Nothing you haven't done before." "My pulse is fine," Felix said, with a returning edge of opinion that made Nico Draven, standing in the doorway, go still in a way Cora would have missed if she hadn't been paying attention. The urgent care lady said, "She was right. I just want to check for myself." She held out her hand. "May I?" Felix extended his wrist with the dignity of someone doing her a favor. His pulse was steady and appropriate. She listened to his breathing. She didn't have a stethoscope, but she had clinical eyes, and the way his chest moved was even, and she asked him to follow her finger for a moment and asked if he had any new symptoms, and he answered everything seriously and with the particular detail of a child who'd been around adults enough to know that adults wanted specifics. "You're doing great," she said. "The scary part's over. Your body got confused today, and that's really uncomfortable, but it sorted itself out." "It hurt," Felix said quietly. "I know." That was the medication making your heart work too hard for a minute. It's not going to keep doing that. Felix looked at his juice glass. Uncle Nico was scared. Cora glanced at the doorway. Nico's face was completely still. That makes sense, she said carefully. You're important to him. He doesn't look scared, Felix observed. He looked like. He searched for the word with the concentration of someone who likes getting things right. Like when you're so scared you go very quiet and you move very fast. Cora looked at the juice glass too. That's a kind of scared, she agreed. Felix picked up the juice glass and drank half of it, which she took as a sign of something returning to normal. Then he looked past her at his uncle and said, with the absolute confidence of a child who knows exactly where his safety lives, "She's nice. Can she stay for dinner?" She stayed for dinner. She couldn't have said why exactly, except that Felix asked with such uncomplicated directness that declining would have required inventing a reason, and she didn't have one. Nico Draven showed no reaction to the request, simply went to the kitchen, and she followed because Felix tugged her by the sleeve. The kitchen was large and serious, the kitchen of someone who used it. Nico cooked without commentary. Pasta, something with tomatoes and basil that smelled like the opposite of every assumption she'd been assembling about him. And Felix sat on the counter despite apparently being told at least twice that the counter was not a chair, and Cora stood near the window and they talked. Not about anything significant. Felix talked about his school, about a specific injustice involving a group project where he had done most of the work. Nico interjected with the dry precision of someone who had heard this story before and had opinions. They argued about whether the group project teacher had been fair, and Cora was conscripted into judging the debate, and she gave her verdict in favor of Felix on a technicality, which Felix received as a triumph, and which made Nico look at her with the almost amusement that she was starting to catalog. After Felix was asleep, he crashed with the completeness of a child who'd spent his adrenaline. Nico poured 2 glasses of wine and they sat in the kitchen and it was quiet. He's extraordinary, Cora said, because he was. He is no caveat, no performance, just certainty. His parents? A pause. My sister, she died 3 years ago. The father wasn't relevant. Cora nodded. She didn't push. She understood the texture of grief that had organized itself into function. You're good with him, Nico said. I like kids. I mean that genuinely, it's not a thing I say. She turned the wine glass. He looks at the world the way you do, like he's that filing everything. Nico looked at her. Is that how I seem? Yes. She met his eyes. It's not bad. It's just observable. He was quiet for a moment. Then, most people don't observe me. They see the idea of me. That's their problem. Something in his expression shifted, the kind of shift that happened when something landed where it wasn't expected. He was quiet in a way that felt like thinking, not absence. Why nursing? He asked. She told him the real answer, not the practiced one. Her mother, 3 years ago, a hospital room in the winter, and the specific nurse who had been there at 2 in the morning when no one else was, who had explained everything in plain words, who had held her mother's hand during a procedure, who had come back on her break to check in. It wasn't an epiphany, Cora said. It was just recognizing what mattered. Nico Draven listened the way he did everything, with complete attention and without the need to fill the silence after. What are you going to do, he said, finally, when you graduate? Trauma unit at Harlow Bay General, if I can get placed. There's a fellowship program. You'll get placed. She smiled a little. You sound very sure. I'm usually right. He said it without arrogance, as observation. And you're the kind of person they're looking for. You don't need me to tell you that. No, she said. But it's interesting that you do. He looked at her across the kitchen table. The city was outside the window, doing its city things. Felix was asleep down the hall. The wine was good. You make it difficult, he said very quietly, to pretend that you're only a person I know in passing. Cora held his gaze. Her heart was doing something specific that she acknowledged and filed. You could stop pretending, she said. Nico Draven looked at her for a long moment. The whole weight of him, all the accumulated consequence of being the person he was, everything that his name meant in this city, and something in it settled like a question resolving. That, he said, would be complicated. I know. She didn't look away. I'm good under pressure. And there it was again. That thing that wasn't quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood. Except this time it reached his eyes. And in his eyes, if you were paying attention, which Cora Wynn always was, it looked a lot like something beginning. If you want to know what came next, whether the girl from the east end of Harlow Bay and the man whose name made the city go quiet actually found a way to navigate the impossible distance between their worlds, whether Felix got to argue about dinner forever, whether Cora Wynn got her trauma fellowship, then you know what to do. Like this video, hit subscribe so you're here when the next story drops. And tell me in the comments, when Cora said I'm good under pressure, did she mean the nursing or did she mean him? I think she meant both.